Well, hello, and welcome to our Bible study. If you've been following along, you know that we're in the Gospel of Luke, mainly looking at the parables of Jesus. The title of our unit is Jesus Storyteller, and we're looking at the parables of Jesus. They're not all found only in Luke, but most of them that we're looking at will occur in Luke only. We'll see parallels from time to time. We've looked at those before. Today's lesson, as you can see, is entitled A Fool's Formula for Failure. Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 31. And if you have your Bibles, you'll want to turn there right now so that we can begin looking at that. Timeless truths from Jesus' parables in the Gospel of Luke. What we're going to be looking at today is something related to greed, and we'll work through that in a moment. But as we do, I want to always give you some kind of parallel passage to look at and keep in mind as we go forward. Today, I want you to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 10 through 11. Keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the parable that we'll read. Keep in mind also James chapter 4, verse 14. Now, really, with the things that we're going to look at in this parable, there are a number of passages in James that we can look at, partly from that verse, but also other places in chapter 4 as well. And then, if time allows, I'll go ahead and look at another passage that kind of pulls in together some of the concluding statements that Jesus makes after the parable. And that's going to be found in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 19, but carrying on for a couple of verses after that. Well, as we said, our text today is going to be dealing with the issue of greed. And to kind of get us started, I want to go with a visual and a quote that might be familiar to some of you. It's an older movie now, made in 1987. And it's a movie entitled Wall Street. And you can see a picture there of Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas. Very, very famous statement that he makes in the movie. Of course, some of you, if you've watched the movie, recognize the issue of Wall Street and money hoarding and things like that. Maybe I'm taking this quote out of context, but I think in what he's doing here, it kind of fits the signs of the times and even some things that we need to be concerned about. And this is actually a screenshot from when he's making that speech in the movie. He says, the point is, ladies and gentlemen, he's here in the stockholders meeting and giving a kind of a rebuttal against some claims made against him. But he says, the point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. He says greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms, greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind. And greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, the company that he is representing, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the United States of America. And then he says, thank you very much, and then leaves. Well, what he is there recognizing is something that we often struggle with and we think drives us, and that is greed. We're always looking for more. I don't want to parallel greed and capitalism. This is not a place to get into the economic issue on a large scale. Many do see capitalism as a greedy enterprise. I don't, but I do think on a personal level, we all need to be thinking about our attitude toward material things. And one of the things that Jesus is going to confront is someone who approaches him with a concern, and Jesus kind of cuts through that concern to then speak to the larger issue and to speak to the crowds in general, not just the man who comes to him. He gives the parable, and then he gives a final word that will underlie all that Jesus is trying to say about that. And then we'll leave with another response at the end with some concluding applications. But as we move forward with this, let me go ahead and get us going back to look at the outline of the text that we're going to be looking at today. And so as we do, again, the title is A Fool's Formula for Failure. The first thing we're going to look at in chapter 12, verses 13 to 15, is a teaching opportunity presents itself. Always, Jesus is going to give a parable to teach, but sometimes that teaching opportunity is brought to him, not one that he prompts. Then we're going to look at the parable of the rich fool, chapter 12, verses 16 to 20. A short parable, but one that has some depth to it when we look at it closely. And then, of course, he'll conclude in verse 21 with a lesson that we are to learn from this parable. And so let's go ahead and begin looking at that. I want to read the text to you first, And then what I want to do is walk through it section by section and phrase by phrase, and maybe finding some things that you hadn't thought of before. I don't think that I'm violating any spirit of the text in doing what I'm about to do, but I think what you're going to find is maybe you're going to put yourself in the position of the original hearers as they hear certain phrases from Jesus throughout this teaching. So let me go ahead and get the text. I'll read it to you, and then we'll walk through it and talk about it section by section. Reading again from the Christian Standard Bible. Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21. Someone from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." "Friend," he said to him, "who appointed me a judge and arbitrator over you?" He then told them, "Watch out and be on your guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions." Then he told them a parable. A rich man, his land was very productive. He thought to himself, "What should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I will do this," he said. "I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Well, as I said, a lot in there. So let's take a moment to look at this going forward. First, he says, someone from the crowd said to him. It's interesting what Jesus will encounter from time to time. Of course, he walked around everywhere he went, and as he would gather crowds. Sometimes he would call crowds to himself. Sometimes they would just gather around him. And it's in these moments that you might get a random statement from the crowd for Jesus to address. And we'll see some other examples in a moment. But this is what happens. Someone just out of the crowd says, "Teacher," or "Rabbi, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So he's enlisting Jesus to help him. Now, you may think, what in the world does Jesus have to do with this? He's going around teaching people about the kingdom of God. Why would Jesus trouble himself with trying to determine how the man and his brother are supposed to divide the inheritance of his father? It does seem random, but we know from other places in Jesus' ministry, we would have this. For instance, even in the Gospel of Luke, the three examples I want to give you is when he's walking about in chapter 9, and a man whose son is possessed by a demon is calling out to Jesus. This is right after the transfiguration, and Jesus and three of his other disciples, Peter, James, and John, are coming down with him, and a man approaches him from the crowd and talks to him about his son. Later on, chapter 11, in the previous chapter, chapter 11:27, there is a woman who calls out randomly as Jesus is teaching and says, "Blessed is the womb of the woman who gave birth to you." And so you have this random statement out of nowhere. And then in Luke chapter 18, verse 36, as Jesus is walking closer toward Jerusalem through Jericho, a man cries out to him. A blind man calls out to him. And so you have just random statements coming out. You also still may think, why is this man calling out to Jesus about the inheritance issue? Well, the thing is that in that culture, many times rabbis would do that. And this is a man who is presuming that Jesus, as a rabbi, would actually participate in this process. Other rabbis did it. Surely Jesus, as a rabbi, would also help make these types of decisions. And so his perception of Jesus is as a rabbi. Clearly, he doesn't know all about who Jesus is, but he's going to go with what he knows about Jesus. Now, Jesus does respond, but it's interesting that he's not going to respond with the attitude or with the content that the man might have expected. His answer is pretty strong, and then he also turns it not only to the man himself, but to the whole crowd. He's going to take this opportunity of an individual encounter to address the entire crowd so that he can use this as an opportunity to teach others. And we're beneficiaries of that, of course, by Luke recording it. He says to Jesus, or Jesus says to the man, "Friend," he said to him, "who appointed me judge and arbitrator over you?" Now, the CSB is taking some liberties there. The word literally is man. And it's similar to the way Jesus would have used the word woman. It's not necessarily being disrespectful. And that's why the CSB is going to go with the word friend there. But it might be a stern word for friend. But he's using the word just man, just the regular word for man, like he would say the woman at the well, woman, or to his mother, woman. It's just a term. But the point is, it's catching the man's attention. And so what he's doing here is he's addressing him, and then he asks a question, who appointed me judge and arbiter or arbitrator over you? And it's kind of interesting, not the same words, but the similar kind of attitude that Jesus had when his mother came to him when they were at the wedding at Cana in John chapter 2. And his mother says to them, they are out of wine. And Jesus says, well, woman, what does that have to do with you and me? What is that between you and me? Well, of course, he goes on to do something, and she understands he's going to, because she tells the people to do whatever he says. Well, Jesus asked the question, and basically in a dismissive type of way, but he may have perceived something about the man that made him hesitate. In other words, he sees something in the way the question is asked. He may know something intuitively. We know that Jesus had certain knowledge at times in his humanity. He didn't always, but there are times that he may have. Maybe something in the background we don't know about that's not reported for us. Either in the attitude of the man or knowing something about the situation, what he's going to do is basically dismiss himself from the case and recognize maybe there's something in the motives behind this guy's question that he wants to deal with on a larger scale. And it must be something related to greed, because that's what his parable is going to be about. So what he does is, rather than discuss this with the man individually, he is going to talk to the crowd. So he's going to use it as an opportunity to talk to all of them. And he does that beginning in verse 15. Notice the text changed from talking to the man specifically to the crowd in general. Verse 15 says, he then told them, watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions. Notice that he does, again, speak to all present. So really, we need to be watching at this and looking at what Jesus has to say, and make sure that we grab all that he says for us and reflect upon our own lives and our own attitudes. He says two things: watch out and be on your guard. Now, the word watch out there is a typical word for just looking and seeing, but the idea is like being on the lookout. Keep your eyes open, be alert, be mindful of who you are and what your circumstances are. And then he follows that up with the phrase, be on guard. It's the idea of keeping guard. And here it's a verb form that requires an ongoing action. Be ever on your guard. So really, you can pull these words together that have the idea of being your own personal watchman, being on guard against things that may threaten your well-being in terms of your attitude toward things. And of course, the thing they need to be on guard against is greed. So he says, look and continually be on guard against, because these kinds of temptations are going to be ever persistent in our lives. And so what Jesus says is, be on guard against all greed. Now, here, I'm just going to say it. In this instance, all means all. He's not talking about just one kind of this or one kind of a, he's saying all. And then he uses the word greed. Now, some of your translations are going to use different kinds of words here. Some translations are going to use the word covetousness. Older translations are going to use the word avarice. And I have to admit, it's not a word I use, so I know what it means, but it's not like a word I'm going to use. It probably is a good word, considering it carries with it a very strong connotation. Covetousness is a word that we know, but we only think about that when we're looking at the 10th commandment, not to covet. And that is the idea that's going on here, as we'll see in a moment. But the idea here is the idea of insatiableness. In other words, let me give you two more phrases what Jesus is talking about. We always need to be on the lookout about never being satisfied with what we have. To flip that around, we always need to be on the lookout for desiring more than what we have. And desiring not so much that we'd like to have more or that we need more, it's that it drives us so much that our attitude toward others may be at risk. And what the parable is going to say here in a moment is, of course, this man's greed that we're going to read about basically took God out of the picture. And so there are things that we have to look at. What emphasis do we put on our possessions? Jesus says our life, our very existence, is not going to be defined by how many things we have. It's not in the abundance of our possessions. And it is a word that means abounding and overflowing. Our life should not be defined by how many cars we have, how big our house is, how many suits we have. It's not to be based on the number of bank accounts we have or how much money is in the banks or properties we have. He says that's not what life is about. Now, we'll say this again in a moment as we look at the parable. He's not saying those things are wrong, but what he is going to do is give a parable to say, you need to be mindful that your life is not defined by those things. Your quality of life is not defined by how much stuff you have. Keep this in mind as we go through the parable. The prompting of the parable is the man asking Jesus to divide the inheritance of their father with his brother. So it seems like this man is more concerned about his own possessions and what rightly belongs to him. And of course, he's right. He has a right to his inheritance. But again, it may be that there's such an overpowering emphasis on these things that Jesus is seeing right through the principle of the inheritance to the attitude that the man has. And so he is concerned about what belongs to him. And as a side note to my side note, unfortunately, we do see at times the death in the family bringing out the worst in some people, that they want to be greedy and make sure they get what they think belongs to them, because that was theirs when they were growing up, or their mom or dad promised them something, or they just think that since they're no longer around, they've had their eyes on it all this time and they just want it. In a sense, even though it may not be a big thing, the attitude is one defining who they are based on what they have. Well, Jesus says one's life is not defined by the possessions that they have. You know, with that could have been the end of the teaching. It's a sound principle. It's something you can take away. It's clear. It's memorable. But Jesus doesn't stop there. While he could have ended with that statement, as straightforward as it is, what he's going to do is he's going to move into a parable. And he's going to do like a good teacher will do, and like a good preacher will do, and a good mentor will do, give an illustration. And here's what he's going to do about basically taking the idea of greed to its logical conclusion and tell us exactly what could be expected if we go the same route with greed. So he gives the parable of the rich fool. We've read it already, so I won't read it again. I want to walk through it line by line with you. But what he does is he sets up a situation, and then we're going to see what this rich man does. And there are some principles or some ideas. There are some hints of things going on here that if we read too quickly, we may not catch. But I'm not the first to do what I'm about to do, but it's interesting to see what we see here, how others have picked up on this. If you read carefully and slowly and closely, you pick up on this as well. And perhaps you did as I was reading. So he first, in verse 16, we're told, Luke says he told him a parable, and he says, a rich man's land was productive. We're talking about not being greedy, but the first thing out of Jesus' parable is that it's about a rich man. So he's already rich. It's a note that we might be quick to overlook because we think about him all of a sudden gaining. But the fact is he was already rich. Being rich is not wrong, as we'll see, but what is about to take place indicates to us the kind of attitude this man really had. He says a rich man's land was very productive. So he's already rich. This is not a man who had little and all of a sudden his crops, bumped up and he was able to grow more than he'd ever grown before. This is something that he had in store, but now there was a very productive year, more than normal. And now he's wondering what he's going to do. So the land produced it. Now I want to keep in mind a couple of things as we get ready to move into the next section here. The land was productive. Now, there are two things I want to point out. Obviously, first is that he's dealing with a farming situation, and that agricultural illustration, like he uses in so many places in his parables, is going to be something familiar to that culture. We could probably apply it in many other ways today to different kinds of wealth building opportunities. Property values go up, or even if you have something in the bank account, stocks go up. Who knows? There could be any number where you get a bonus at work. You get a new job that pays more. There are a number of ways that we can, in our society, make a parallel here. Clearly, the idea is that this man is a farmer and is already wealthy by virtue of his farming, but now he's experienced a great increase. But it's the land that's producing it. The thing that we need to recognize here is that while it's an agricultural illustration that's familiar to them, the second thing I want you to point out and understand is while it's agricultural, the key is here when it relates to what we're about to read with this man, the land did the producing. Now, again, because he's wealthy, he's got, farm hands, he's got help and so forth. But what Jesus is saying here is that the land did the producing. There was something special about the land. We're not told what happened. Jesus doesn't go into all the details. He doesn't say that it rained extra that year or the temperatures were mild. It doesn't say anything that. He also doesn't mention the role of God in here. He doesn't say God blessed him. But I think what Jesus is doing here is being very precise in the way that he's presenting this parable. And as I often say to my students, there are no wasted words in the Bible. What we also need to do then is take stock of what he does say and see what he's communicating, even perhaps by what he doesn't say. He doesn't bring up God at this point, but that's where the kick is coming. So he's talking about the land producing. But notice what happens in verses 17 through 19. We're going to go through them individually, but one of the things we want to see at first is that once the man starts talking, he's talking to himself. We're seeing a man in conversation with himself. Now, at this point, we can venture off a little bit. As I said a moment ago, Jesus is very limited in what he says here. That often leads us to do some speculation, and that's okay. But let's do it, and then we'll come back to the text a little bit. So he's talking to himself. The question is, why is he talking to himself? We don't know, but we could ask some questions. Is it that he has no one else to talk to? Clearly, being a rich man, he has some kind of family. He certainly has people to help. Is it that he doesn't want to talk to somebody else? Maybe he doesn't want to talk to somebody else because he doesn't want to hear their suggestions. He's just reasoning this out in himself. The word that's used for talking to himself, he's thinking to himself, he's reasoning, he's having a dialogue with himself. So he's having this idea of working through questions and answers by himself. Is it that he avoids asking so that he avoids asking somebody else so he doesn't have someone else taking advantage of him? We'll get in a moment to what Jesus is getting at here with this parable later, but certainly some options open to him would be to use some of this to help other people. He doesn't do this. So in verse 17, he says this. We'll get back to a little bit more of this in a moment with indications of how selfish he is. But he says, Jesus in the parable says, he thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? So he asked himself, what shall I do? He's got so much that it's his storerooms, his barns, if you will, aren't big enough to hold all that he has. So first he's talking to himself, asks himself, what should I do? Why is he talking to himself? We've entertained some of the questions. We don't know any of the answers. Who knows why? But what goes on in these verses indicates how selfish this man is. While we have lots of speculation about why the man is only talking to himself, Jesus doesn't say. We can say this, by and large, it's not the primary issue in the parable. We know it is a parable. We don't want to look too deeply at all the details, but how Jesus presents this does allow us to have some speculation. Where Jesus goes with the parable, of course, reveals to the crowd and to us as the readers what the heart of the man was. He's talking to himself. First clue of his selfishness is that he's talking only to himself. Another clue, and this is not something that I consulted others to find. I was just happy that I saw others making the same observations. One thing that jumped out at me as I was reading this was once you see that he's talking to himself, you also see the language that he uses with regard to what he's going to do. Almost a dozen times in the few verses here, we see references to the pronoun I or me or my. Notice as we read through this, notice the first person pronouns that are used. He thought to himself, there's a third person reference, but there's the idea of selfishness. He reasoned with himself, and then you have the discussion take place. Notice the discussion he's having with himself, and that's going to be an interesting twist in a moment. He says, what will I do? I don't have any space for my stuff. That's just verse 17. We move to verse 18. He then asks his question and then answers it. So the first is he asks himself, what will I do? Verse 18, he follows this up with, I will do this. Or some translations will say, this is what I'm going to do. He says, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. Now, is he really going to be the one to tear them down, or is someone else going to do it? Even if he's having someone else do it for him, notice that he's using the verb or the pronoun I. I will do this. I will tear down my barns and I will build. Now, in the Christian Standard Bible, the word I will with the verbs there is mentioned only the one time, but there are two verbs here, each of them in the first person. I will tear down, I will build up, I will store. So you have him doing all the action. And then he says it's for my grain and my goods. So notice again, all of the conversation, everything that is taking place. So there are two things going on. He says he's going to tear down and build back up. All right. So again, keep in mind the selfish nature there. My, I will do, I will do, I will do. Now, real quick before we move on to verse 19 and conclude this part before God jumps in a moment. Is it wrong to rent storage space for our things? Now, I bring that up out of nowhere because for many of us, the idea of having a storage shed in our yard is one thing. But many people today, if you drive around, you'll see many places that you can rent storage from. It could be anywhere from your boats and your RVs to just having a 10 by 10 room or a 6 by 10 room to store extra stuff that won't fit in your house. But if you drive around much, you know that there are storage places all over the place. Is it wrong to have those? Is there a signal to having those? This man obviously needed the barns for the grain. He just felt his barns were inadequate. He built bigger ones. My brother actually has said that if you need a separate storage facility in order to keep your stuff, you have too much stuff. Now, we could quibble over that and debate about that, but it is interesting to note that there is a similar issue that we have in our lives today with regard to the stuff that we have, and particularly in the United States, where there is an abundance for most people, we have a lot of stuff. And I'll be the first to admit I have a lot of stuff, and my kids will be the first to admit to you what some of that stuff is. Is it wrong to have that storage space? Is that a signal to us that we need to do something else with that material? Who knows? That's not for me to answer for you. That is something for you to think about in consideration with regard to this parable and just our attitudes in general. So the man has been having this conversation. What will I do? I will do this. I will tear down, build barns, store my stuff, all this going on. Then in verse 19, he says, then I will say to myself. So he's already having a conversation in the air, so to speak. I will do this, I will do that. And then he says, I will say to myself. And the quote is, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. So first thing he's going to do is store things up, make room for all of his stuff, and then he's going to take it easy. And we'll get to that in a moment. But I want you to see something that most of you aren't going to see in the modern translations. He says, I will say to myself, and he literally says the word for self. Self, you have many things. You have many goods stored up for many years. I think it's interesting. He says, I will say to myself, self, and that's the word that's often translated soul. I will say to myself, soul. It's kind of interesting to have that conversation in the second person with yourself like that. And I just find that kind of interesting that Jesus is actually portraying this man, not only talking to himself, but actually carrying on this conversation. And what does he say to himself? You have many things for a long time. He says, you have many things stored up for many years. There are a number of things that are going on here. One, when he says you have, even though he's talking in the second person, it's still reference to his selfishness. He's still thinking about himself. All these things that he has them. Second, he says many good things laid up or stored up for a long time. And then he says for many years. Now, clearly what he has is going to last a long time. But there's a presumption built in, and that's going to be revealed here in a moment. The presumption is not only does he have things that will last many years, presumably he will be around many years also to enjoy them. And another thing is, it may not be that he's giving consideration to the fact that in the next year, he'll have another crop being grown and harvested. Now, he doesn't take into consideration that there might be a bad year. He doesn't speculate that there'll be another good year, but he is focused in on the moment. I have many goods stored up for many years. And again, the presumption is that he will be around many years. He's not considering a number of things in this text. Everything is about himself. He's not talked to anybody else. He's not given consideration to anybody else with regard to what he will do with this stuff. Notice what is not said. What is not said is that he even gave consideration to sharing it with his workers, giving it to the poor, or anything like that. What he has, he says, belongs to him. And he's only thinking about this life. And the point of that is brought out at the end of the parable as well. Perhaps the man thought his riches were indication of God blessing him. Now, where does that come from? Let me step back a moment. At the beginning of the parable, of course, we said the land produced much. Many in that culture would have seen that as a blessing from God. But this man doesn't give any indication of that at all. His land gave it to him, and he still takes the credit for it. He's the one saying, I've done all the work. I've been blessed. Again, he doesn't acknowledge God. God is going to step in the picture in a moment and reveal himself. And as he does, it's obviously not in a positive way. It could be, though, that while it is a parable, he's thinking this blessing is from God. We do know in that culture many times wealth and even being a little overweight, having things was, and having good health was a gift from God. It was a sign of God's blessing. If it is, in Jesus' estimation, to be understood as a sign of blessing from God, this man is not acknowledging it. It just is one more indication of how selfish this man is. So what does he say? What he says to himself is, I have many good things stored up for many years. What do I do next? The next thing I do is I take it easy. I relax. I refresh myself. I rest. Now, there are a number of places that that kind of word is used throughout the New Testament. Won't go through all of those. It's not like real numerous, but there are a few places where I think it's important. But what I'll just say here is his point is that there's a fourfold thing that he's going to do: rest, eat, drink, and enjoy himself, or what some of your translations may say, be merry. The idea is relax. One could rightly ask this, however: how hard did he really work to gain so much that he needs to rest? Remember, a moment ago, we said it was the land that did the producing. And likely he had many, many servants to do the harvesting. So does he really work that hard that he needs to take a rest? Again, a sign of selfishness. Did he not expect to have to harvest year after year, or have people harvest year after year? He's ready to take it easy. He has things to last a long time, but he's going to take it easy, thinking that he himself will be around a long time. Was he going to stop until he needed to start producing more again, or did he think it was just going to happen? I know. It's more speculation on my part. Can't help but to think how fun it is to do that, just to kind of read between the lines in some ways. Jesus is able to pack a lot of ideas into very small portions of text. And I think it's important we at least give some consideration to this. If anything, what I'm doing is helping you see that one of the key features of this text is this guy's selfishness and his greed. He has so much. He's already rich. He holds back more. And now he thinks he's set so that he can take it easy. And then he uses a phrase that's very familiar to us, and you want to be patient with me because I want to pick up on this phrase that I think may give us even more understanding of what's going on in this text that often is not touched upon, I should say. So it's seldom touched upon, if ever, at least not to the depth that I want to do it today. He says, eat, drink, and be merry, or eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. One, again, he thinks he has many, many years to go. But he's using a phrase that, if you are paying attention, sounds very familiar to some other places in Scripture where we've heard this. We know that in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 32, for instance, Paul says this in a negative way. He says, if there's no resurrection, then we might as well just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Now, he doesn't make up that phrase. He gets that from Isaiah 22, when there's a prophecy against Jerusalem and war against Jerusalem. And it's kind of a saying of despair. Let's just eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But in reality, the idea of eating and drinking and being merry or celebrating is a very important thing in the Old Testament that carries through many places in the Old Testament. And I want to point out a few of those as we move forward. as we do, I just want to real quick step in and say this. We mentioned looking at James chapter 4, verse 14, with regard to presumption. That comes in this place. You want to go back and look at chapter 4, verses 13 to 17 in general, and then also look at the beginning of chapter 5, verses 1 to 6. We talked about that in a previous lesson. We looked at the letter of James back in the fall. The point is not making presumptions about things, that we should be reliant upon the Lord for all that we have and for where we will go and what plans we will make. This man certainly was not doing any of that. What he did was something similar to what the author in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 10 through 11 do, acknowledging that there was an abundance of wealth. Now, in that particular verse, the author is talking about looking back on his life in despair, recognizing he had all these things, but it didn't really mean much in the long run. But we have a man like this in the parable who has gained a lot materially. So he's living as if there's only this life, this man in the parable. He's living only for himself, and he's living without consideration for when or not he would be around. How long is he going to live? So there's more that I want to talk about. As we do this, as I said, be a little patient with me, because I think I'm going to highlight something that's going to be very, very helpful here in what it means to eat, drink, and be merry, and how this man is turning it around with his attitude. So first, let me make this general statement before we go through a few passages. The idea of eating and drinking is a sign of accomplishment. Notice he says, let's relax, eat, drink, and be merry. That is a significant thing to say after the job is done, or after a task has been accomplished, so to speak. And therefore, it should be something to be enjoyed. But also, as we're going to see in many of these texts, it is something to be seen as a gift from God. It's a rest from struggle. It's a relaxation from a hard day's labor, or going through a difficult time, or seeing a job completed, so forth. This man has given himself all the credit for what he has been gifted. Now, we're not told it's from God. The implication it's from God. But he thinks he's done it all. So think about this. His land has brought forth his crops, and as a result, his wealth has increased. This should be understood as a provision that God has made, something that should have been credited to God. And one way that could have been exhibited would be through giving to others and to God in service to God, as we'll see at the conclusion of the text. But he kept it for himself. The idea then is, yes, eating and drinking and being merry is something that's legitimate when the work is done. We'll see some verses along the lines there in a moment, but it's also seen as something that God grants and should be enjoyed with God. There are a litany of texts then throughout the Old Testament that support this idea. So let me go through these, and hopefully you'll see the picture here. Exodus 32, verses 5 through 7. Now, this is in the negative because it's at the foot of Mount Sinai when Moses is receiving the law. And what happens is Aaron and the Israelites are putting together a quote celebration, and they are going to be worshiping the God that they've created in the calf, but they're going to use the word Yahweh here. In the text, you hear the phrase, let's eat and drink and party. They got up, they ate, they drank, they got up to party, which is normally something as a demonstration of fellowship offering to the Lord. They say they're doing it as a fellowship offering to the Lord, but it's clearly not to the Lord. They're using eating and drinking and enjoying themselves, celebrating, going into party with a fellowship offering, something intended for the Lord, but in this case was not to the Lord. 1 Samuel 30, verse 16, eating, drinking, and celebrating as a result of defeating the Philistines. The Amalekites celebrated their defeat of the Philistines, so they were eating and drinking and celebrating. 1 Kings 4:20, Judah and Israel were eating and drinking and rejoicing. Nehemiah 8:12, they began to eat, drink, and send portions and have a celebration. This is after coming back from exile and renewing the covenant. Of course, very familiar passages related to eating and drinking come from the book of Ecclesiastes. And so we've already talked about Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. But in chapter 2, verse 24, we read this: there is nothing better for a person than to eat drink, and enjoy his work, I have seen that even this is from God's hand, because who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from him? Now, some translations are going to say there that you have something along the lines of there is no good in a person who eats and drinks and enjoys, but to do this apart from God. Or other translation might be his soul sees good in doing this. But the point is the eating and the drinking and the enjoying are done in the context of recognizing this comes from God. So in what seems to be a rather pessimistic document does demonstrate that doing these things apart from God is what makes them meaningless. Here, the author is saying eating and drinking, enjoying work, this comes from God. Keep in mind that this man in the parable is eating and drinking, enjoying himself, and never acknowledges God. Chapter 3, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 12 to 14. I know that there is nothing better for him than to rejoice and enjoy his good life. Some translations say the good life. Some translations will say his good life. It is also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts. I know that everything good does, I know everything God does will last forever. There is no adding to it or taking from it. God works so that people will be in awe of him. Here is a text that recognizes the provision of God, and the result is people are in awe of God. The eating and drinking and enjoying one's efforts is a gift from God. This man has not acknowledged that. These show that what was meant to be enjoyed as a gift of God, the rich man took credit for himself. He eliminated God, or at least he gave no consideration to God. And what we see is Jesus is going to point this out in verse 21. Another text, Ecclesiastes 5, verses 18 through 20. Here is what I have seen to be good, the author says. It is appropriate to eat, drink, and experience good in all the labor one does under the sun during the few days of his life God has given him, because that is his reward. Furthermore, everyone to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also allowed him to enjoy them, to take his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God, for he does not often consider the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy of his heart. And then last one, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but I think you'll understand why I include it. This is Ecclesiastes 8, verses 14 to 15. He says this: there is a futility that is done on the earth. There are righteous people who get what the actions of the wicked deserve, and there are wicked people who get what the actions of the righteous deserve. I say this too is futile. Of course, he's complaining about the fact that the righteous aren't always rewarded and the wicked aren't always punished. Verse 15, he goes on to say, so I commended enjoyment, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat, drink, and enjoy himself, for this will accompany him in his labor during the days of his life that God gives him under the sun. Notice again the connection, the eating and drinking and making merry or enjoying one's work as a gift from God. This man has done none of that. Ecclesiastes 9:7, go, eat your bread with pleasure and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already accepted your works. So we see something along the lines here of when Jesus says, the man said to himself, take it easy, rest, relax, refresh yourself, eat, drink, and be merry. Think about the people in the crowd hearing that and perhaps having this whole background. Is this man is eating and drinking and being merry, something that's supposed to be a gift from God when the labor is done or when the victory is won, and this man has not acknowledged that at all. When he encounters God, it will not be in the positive way. So what was intended to be shared with God, this man has kept to himself. And here it comes, verse 20. But God said to him, you fool. And he literally just says, fool. This very night, your life is demanded of you. Some of your translations will say, your life is required of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? This is going to tie back into the idea of inheritance there in a moment. Here at the beginning, the man wants his part of the inheritance because his brother is not sharing it. He's hoarding it and he's being greedy about wanting it from his brother. In this context, the man has not given any consideration about the future. And in this case, his immediate future or anyone else's future. Notice the text says, but God said to him. So he's been talking to himself, having this conversation, thinking about all that he's done, what he's going to do. He's not said anything to God, but God said to him. And he says, fool. Once God does appear, we see this. Now, a quick side note, I'm going to look into this a little bit further. The time didn't allow me to do this time. But it's interesting. God appears in many parables in Jesus' teaching. Many times, though, when God appears in the parable, it's in the form of a particular character, like the father in the story of the prodigal son. Okay. Here, God appears as God. And what I want to do is go back and study Jesus' parables and see how often when God does appear in a parable, it's actually as himself and not a character portraying him. There's no character portraying God in this text. This is the man in relationship to God directly. When God does speak, we have an unexpected conversation. He had not shown indication, the man, of talking with God ever. And I know it's a short parable and therefore the argument from silence. But when God does speak, he speaks first. And yet they are not the words that the man would have expected. The man is expecting to live a long time. And yet he thinks he's going to live a long time, but God has other plans. He says, you fool. The word there means mindless one or being unthinking. Now, I know what you're also thinking is, but Jesus said not to call anyone a fool. Well, two things involved with that. One, someone like God can call a person a fool if they fit the bill, if they fit the characteristic or the description. But the other thing is, this is not that word. The Aramaic word raka is a word that Jesus used, and then the word for fool there is a different word altogether. It's, I think, the idea of the word for more, we get our word moron. The idea for this word, though, it comes from a word meaning not thinking, not using your mind, being mindless, being absent-minded is being absent-minded is more of a euphemism there. It's so much stronger than that. And this word occurs in a number of places in the New Testament. It's a word, for instance, that Paul would use when he's talking about his visions in 2 Corinthians chapters 11 and 12 and so forth, where he can use this regard to even the Jews in Romans chapter 2 about how they think of themselves as teachers of the fools and so forth. We won't go into all those texts there, but I just want you to recognize that, you know, Jesus is not violating his own command about not calling someone a fool, but it is a different word. God says you're a fool. You're being mindless. You've not been thinking things through. Notice he has been thinking and reasoning with himself, but he's not been thinking things through. He's been lacking that thinking. So what is foolish? The man has been planning that he is going to take it easy because he has a long life ahead of him and a life of ease because he has many material possessions. At least what he has in his grains is something he can sell and have money for a long, long time. The problem is, as Jesus says, God tells the man, this very night, your life is demanded of you. You think that you're living, but you're dying. If he had in mind, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, and there it's said in a negative way, even if he thinks it's tomorrow, God says it's tonight. Your life is cut short, even shorter than that. You have miscalculated what your life is and how long you will last. He was presuming. The question that comes after that is interesting. All the things you've attained, whose will it be? It gets back to the theme of inheritance, as we said a moment ago, with the idea that the man raised with Jesus and sharing his inheritance with his brother. Whose stuff will your stuff be, or to whom will your stuff go? See, when he got all these things, he never gave thought to where he could give it, or how he could share it, or how he can serve God through it. He kept it, what he was going to do with it himself. Jesus then in verse 21 gives us the lesson to learn. This is how it is. It literally says, thusly the one treasuring to himself and not being rich toward God or unto God. The CSB reads this way. That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. We need to recognize that the material things we have are temporary. More so, we need to recognize that we in this flesh are temporary. We know that if we're believers, that we will be raised up. We do spend eternity in heaven. But what we do recognize is that in this life, it is temporary. the nature of our life with regard to material things is temporary. This man was holding on to things. He was allowing them to control him and his decision making because he put too much focus on his things. He didn't use them for God. He treasured them to himself. He didn't use them to be rich toward God. Now, the text doesn't say what that will be, but it just shows that the man's attitude was toward himself and not toward anyone else. Now, a couple of comments before we come to conclusion. First, it's very important to note, riches are not wrong. It's what you do with them. And in fact, those that are wealthy, that do good things with them, are demonstrating the blessing of God to other people. That might be giving to church, it might be giving to charities, it might be helping people in other ways. It could be helping people find jobs through the investments that you make and so forth. There are a number of ways that you can take what you have and help others with it. But we don't seek wealth for its own sake. We do know that 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19, Paul tells Timothy to help people guard against the desire for wealth because of the things that it will bring, the worry and the mindset that it brings. Jesus uses a phrase here about storing up. It's the same word that is used in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to following. He says, you should not store up treasures for yourselves on earth, where you know that the thief can come in and steal, the moth can eat away at it, and it will just be corrupted. He says, rather store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Literally, treasure up for yourselves treasures in heaven. It's the same word that we get our word treasure from. It's the same word that's used here. This man treasured things to himself, but was not rich toward God. Jesus is saying we should treasure up things to heaven, not to ourselves. So what can we do in terms of application? We need to evaluate our attitude toward money and material things. And I think even as Christians, we can fall into a pattern of materialism. Obviously, there is a worldview out there, even within professing Christianity, that says that one way to demonstrate God's blessing on your life is that he gives you an abundance of wealth. But what is our attitude toward the things that we have? I think the other thing we need to do is acknowledge that God is the provider, and that that will lead to help us remember to consult God with what we do with our resources. How are we going to be rich toward God? That is often going to be by being rich toward other people and helping other people. The man failed to mention God as a source on the front end, and whether by coincidence or actual causation, he failed then to seek the wisdom for God on how to use the wealth on the back end. And as a result, he suffered the consequences. What will it mean then for you, to get really personal, and for me? What does it mean for you and me to be rich toward God? Jesus doesn't say. I think as you look at his life and ministry, we can see some examples, helping people in need, providing for the ministry of people who are serving the Lord and so forth. There are a number of ways we can do that. Then we need to do this. Consider God's question of the rich fool. Who will get your stuff? Are you making provisions for the stuff that you have? Now, again, that's really down the line in terms of what it means to be giving things away in inheritance, but it does mean you're being responsible for what you're doing and making plans for the future, being mindful that this life is temporary. As a result, then a follow-up question would be, to whom can you be generous? Now, probably what may be going on is, if someone's going to be that generous toward God for the things that he blessed them with, and that leaves them with nothing, what does that mean? Interestingly enough, in the continuing narrative in Luke, Jesus goes on to talk about not worrying about what you will wear, not worrying about what you will eat, not worrying about where you will sleep, because God is going to provide. As much as he cares for the birds of the air and the grass and the ground and so forth, he's going to care for you. And maybe that someone may ask the question, if I'm so generous, what's going to happen if I give it all away? Jesus' connection here is, don't worry, God is going to provide. We see a connection with that in Matthew chapter 6, verse 31 and following, where he says not to worry about eating and drinking and what you will wear. It's a different context. We see Matthew and Mark will often put things in different contexts. But the point is, don't worry about how you're going to have things provided. Don't worry about how God is going to meet your need when you are being generous toward others. Anyone else who had much, and if they were to give it to help others, to be rich toward God, they would not be without because God would provide. Let me read that one more time because I just kind of threw myself right into that quote. Anyone else who had much, and if they were to give it to help others so as to be rich toward God, they would not be without because God would provide. Acknowledge on the front end that God is the one providing. Acknowledge on the other end that when you are giving and being generous, God will provide. In conclusion, then, may we have a correct perspective on material things and have a proper trust toward God to provide. It may be hard in our society today when so many things are caught up with what we have. We need to understand that the things that we have are to be tools that we use, not things that possess us. May we learn from the rich fool and be sure to make provision for what we're going to do, knowing that what we have, as James says, every good and perfect gift comes from God. May we then use it to give him honor and glory. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that you love us and that you care for us. We thank you that Jesus spoke a word of wisdom to the crowds that we can apply to our lives. And it's a word that speaks very directly at us at times because we do live in a culture that puts so much emphasis on material things, whether it's making a certain amount of money or having a certain kind of car or a certain number of items. We as Christians, even though we want to serve you, find ourselves being caught in the culture of material and materialism. Help us to have a right attitude toward material things. Help us to have a right attitude toward the nature of our life. We know that as believers, we have eternal life with you. And the quality of that is going to be vastly far and above and beyond all that we might even think we could try to acquire in this life. But we do know that this life is temporary as it is presented until you renew all things. So I pray, Father, you'll help us daily to keep in mind the things that we have and the purpose for which they are to be used. Help us, Lord, to be rich toward you. Forgive us for our selfishness. And I pray that you will renew our minds and renew our thinking, renew our hearts, so that we will be rich toward you and being rich toward others. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. We continue on with our parables for next week as well. And as we do, we're going to be looking at an interesting title, and we'll look at the meaning of the parable later. But the title is, Why Do Good People Suffer? This is Luke chapter 13, verses 1-9, another short passage. And the parable itself is very, very short as well. But it's interesting because the parable is the parable of the fruitless fig tree, the barren fig tree. So you're wondering, how in the world does that tie into the idea of people suffering? You've got to come back to our next lesson and find out. I hope that you found this meaningful. I pray that it will touch you in such a way as it will help you through your thinking, and that it will draw you closer to God and helping you prepare to be who God's called you to be. Until the next lesson, when I see you again, I pray that you will be well and that you will be blessed.